Hello everyone. So this will be a continuation of a video I made, I think a few months ago, on the great books of the world. So I got really interested in that idea, and I think it just so happened that I started thinking this way at the same time that in my own life I'm at a natural transition period because I've been, give or take, I've been out of high school for about 10 years, been out of college for about 5. Um, I'll be turning 30 before too long. And, I've been thinking back on my time as a reader, and I've been really seriously thinking about, like, okay, well, what have I spent my time on? Has it been effective? Not effective. I think the way I'd rather say it is, have I devoted my time to what I feel I should have? And I'm not totally upset with how I spent my time reading, but I think it is totally imbalanced. And that is one thing I wanted to fix by thinking more about the great books of the world. Now, this will just be kind of a free-flowing video. I have the whole list in front of me here on my computer. I'll be posting a public version of the list. And yeah, I'll just be kind of sharing my considerations for it before I actually get into the list. I will go through the whole list, with highlighting some particular things. I also have some books to show off, in the sense of, like, from each portion of the list, you could say. I tried to get a book from each 100, so, like, it'll make sense when I go into the list. But so as I started to make my list, what were my main considerations? Well, firstly, I wanted to look at other lists of great works. And so the most obvious starting points might be something like Harold Bloom has a list for the Western canon. There's a great books list that Britannica put out in the 50s with University of Chicago and I'm blanking on his name, but whoever the guy was that was one of the leaders on making that book series, which is, 100 volumes? But again, it's like only Western. Then I looked at the Sacred Works of the East that was done in the late 1800s, mainly by Max Muller out of Oxford. James Legge helped with that, with the Chinese. Max Muller was an expert specifically on Indian subcontinent religions and languages. And that's a good starting point, I would say, at least to broaden the scope. But then you're left with a huge gap with the Islamic world, especially the Islamic Golden Age. And there's not really a good list for that, at least that I could find anywhere. Not as cohesive, like, oh, here's 100 books that totally summarize the Islamic world, or not summarize, but capture. So I kind of had to do that one on my own. So that was kind of a starting point. Okay, what are the great books lists that people have already made? And of course, in the United States, in the English language, in, general Europe, they are heavily biased towards Western books. And I think in the end, my list is 2. But I think, given the fact of, you could say, my heritage and my own languages I speak and so on, I think that's inevitable. You're never going to get a fully universal book list. I think, at least from one person making it, it would be really hard for one person to be able to manage that. And that's the reason why I decided to call it my personal great books of the world, because it's a bit contradictory, where, of course, you have my personal favorite books, and then you have great books, and they seem to be somewhat at odds, to call your personal favorites greats or greats being decided as personal favorites. But I think the list I tried to make and that I did make is a bit in between, where inevitably my taste and my history, my background, my understanding of the world will influence it, but I really did try my best, at my current age, to get as universal of a scope possible. And so that's what I tried to do. So that's basically the starting point. As I went through, I made a list, and then I went back and saw, okay, what am I missing? And then I did some research, looked at my library, filled it in, then looked at what I had, saw what I was missing, filled it in, saw what I was missing. I asked some people. I was kind of running through this process with some of the guys in my Discord and just trying to, really think it through. And I've been working on this, I would say, seriously for about 3 to 4 months, but mentally maybe for about 6 months. I was thinking about this quite a lot over the past summer because of my interest in, Chinese literature and civilization, and the fact that stuff is really, really, like, embarrassingly underread in English-speaking culture. So, I think that is all I wanted to say at the very beginning to get into the list. There's one other thing. So again, to emphasize the fact that this is my list, this really is the list for my own personal library. This is my own goal for my personal library. The public list doesn't have what I already own and what I've read. My own personal list does have that, and basically I did a percentage of, out of the total books, what do I own, what have I read partially, and then what have I read in full. And that will make more sense once I go into the list. And basically what I want, like my goal over the next at least 10 years, if not for the rest of my life, is to personally acquire the books on this list and then just spend my time reading them. And I want to quit looking for new books because inevitably when you're young, you have to spend a ton of time looking for new books, especially if you don't come from a background where your family has a library already established. And so that is one of the things, looking back on the last 10 years, I've spent a ton of time looking for books, looking for new books, educating myself on just the different canons of the world, you could say. And again, that's necessary and important, but I want to be done doing that. And so putting a ton of effort into this list saves me a lot of time in the future of doing the same looking over and over and over. So I can just refer back to my list. So I did try to keep it relatively small. Relatively small, because this list could have easily been 2,000 to 3,000 authors if I tried to include absolutely everything that's important for world culture. Now, that'll be a job for some other group of people. For myself, this is literally my goal for my library. You could say bucket list library, or library of the Ark, or something you could say. All right. So I think that is really, that's pretty much what I wanted to say. So I think we will just get into the list. So ideally, if everything went to plan, I've posted this in the description and you can follow along if you would like. Now, there are some changes I made to my own personal version that are not going to be showing up in the public version. Now, this is a work in progress. This will always be a work in progress. I would guess that this list is 90% complete, meaning maybe I only have 40 to 50 authors or works to add. And I'll explain the gaps as I go. that I anticipate filling in those 40 to 50 works. But, you know, kind of, again, my goal is a space goal too, and with my personal library. I currently have 8 shelves kind of like this, or no, 7 shelves like this, that size. And I really only want to add one more. And that leaves me with about 800 to 900 books available of space on the shelf. And that's all I want. That's all I want. And I don't want to keep adding, and I want to get rid of things that aren't on this list, basically. All right, so with that being said, I'm just going to talk through my thoughts on adding things. And, you know, in the end, this kind of thing has to be collaborative. So if this list interests you and you think I've missed some things, I would love it if you commented in the comment section on this video and explained, like, oh, I think you've missed this one. This is the reason why you should add it, this kind of thing. Because, of course, I'll add this more, and it can be kind of a collaborative list to a degree. You know, again, this is my personal list. I would love it if other people made their list. And, you know, that's the best way to do it, I think, where if I make my list, you make your list, we compare what are we missing, what are we excessively focused on, maybe something like that. Okay, so anyway, feel free to do whatever you want to do. Okay, so I began with the origin of literature, world literature, and that is the ancient Sumerian texts. I want to get a general anthology of Sumerian writing. I don't have one currently. I know which one I want. I'm pretty sure it's an Oxford. Jeremy Black, I think is his name. Basically, anthology of Sumerian something. But anyway, that's why I started with that, because it's the first thing. That explains another organizing factor of this whole list, is that I organized it by, if at all possible, the birth and death date of the author. Now, if I couldn't get the birth and death date of the author even close, like even within a century, then I either defaulted to when a book was published, because sometimes we know when a book was published but not who wrote it. And then, as you'll see, a lot of the books in the beginning, I gave the time span for when the book was composed. Many times it was an oral work, and then it was written down hundreds or thousands of years later. So I wrote when it was either composed or compiled into a set text. That's especially relevant in the early parts. In the later parts, I did birth and death date of the author, and then I put it in order strictly that way, so by birth date. And it makes you make some interesting connections that you didn't consider beforehand. So, all right, anyway, Sumeria. Then we have ancient Egyptian writing. I have a 3-volume edition that one of my friends kindly sent me, so that's all I need there. Then we have the Epic of Gilgamesh, which presumably came later than some of the other ancient Sumerian writing. The edition I have is by Andrew George, and that explains some of the parentheses. For a decent chunk of these, where I had a strong opinion, I put the ideal translator, the last name, in parentheses, so that if you are interested in, you see this list and you think, oh, wow, I've never read the Epic of Gilgamesh. Which edition should I get? Oh, I'll look for the one translated by George, Andrew George. So that was my goal there. It's also for me just to keep in mind, like, which translators do I like and appreciate them. But it's also for other people if they haven't looked into a certain text. Then we get to the I Ching. John Minford is my favorite edition by far. That's the first book in Chinese civilization, compilation of texts that kind of became one book. Then we have the Rig Veda, which is the first text in the, Sanskrit Indian tradition, you could say. And that is the 3-volume edition by Stephanie Jameson and Joel Brereton. Then, of course, we get to Homer. The only edition I want to read really for the rest of my life is George Chapman's edition, the Iliad and the Odyssey. My default to recommend to people is the Fagles. If you haven't read it yet, I think that's good from an American perspective. But Chapman gets it on the artistry. Hesiod, I've not read him yet at all, so can't say much about that, but he's roughly contemporary with Homer. Then we get another one of the earliest texts of what we now call the Middle East. The Hymns of Zoroaster, the Avesta, translated by M.L. West, and he's an amazing scholar, so I trust his translations. We have the Principal Upanishads by Patrick Olivelle, and I was lucky enough to find a bilingual edition of that. The Upanishads, to a degree act as commentaries on the Vedas. Collected Pre-Socratics, that's a 2-volume edition by Cambridge. And then this is one of the things that's kind of out of order, but it's all so far back and we have no clear idea exactly when these things were written that I put them all together because I have them in a 5-volume set. Leggie's edition of the Confucian classics, the Shijing, the Shujing, the Spring and Autumn Annals and Commentary, the Analects, and Mencius. And those I put in order. And they supposedly were all collected by Confucius in the 600 to 500 BC range. So they were at least compiled then. We also have the Book of Rites, which is important. It's not in that set, but roughly same time frame. And then we have Sappho, 630 BC to 570 BC. My edition I have of that is Guy Davenport, 7 Greeks, which is an amazing translation. The Tao Te Ching, Lao Tzu, and Zhuangzi. Then we have the Greek playwrights, Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, and then we have Herodotus and Thucydides in there too. They were all basically contemporary, and I've not done nearly enough reading as I should have on the Greek playwrights, so that's something I need to work on. Probably not in the short term, if I'm being honest with myself. Can't imagine I'll get to that in the next year, maybe Aeschylus, but at some point in the next few years, I'll definitely read through a decent chunk of the Greek playwrights. Of course, Aristophanes too is the youngest out of them. Made fun of a lot of the older ones. Then we get to fundamentally origin of philosophy in the West. We have Plato and Aristotle. And again, one of the beautiful things about setting a list up like this is that you get Chu Yuan. This Chinese poet had nothing to do with Plato and Aristotle, but you realize that he's alive when they were. That's Songs of the South. That's the second biggest, most important anthology of Chinese poetry after the Book of Poetry or the Book of Odes that Confucius collected. Many of them come from the Zhou dynasty. Then, around 300 BC, scholars think, the Mahabharata and the Ramayana were compiled from oral histories. And so I put those together. The Dhammapada also was compiled roughly around that time. That's one of the central texts of Buddhism. Then we get to Polybius and Sima Qian, which is so fascinating to realize that they're living at the same time. These two great historians from totally different eras. Polybius is at the rise of Rome. Sima Qian, the Grand Scribes records, is 100 years into the Han Dynasty, organizing all that information. So just fascinating. And then we get to really what I would really consider one of the first golden ages in human culture, where we get to the Greeks kind of handing off a cultural torch to Rome, and then Rome really just runs with it. And time-wise, we really start with Cicero, who I need to do a lot more reading of, Lucretius, Sallust, Virgil, and got a visual here. This is a book I picked up recently of Virgil's Eclogues, or Bucolics. It's a very interesting edition, translated into English verse, framed by Cues for Reading by John Van Sickle. And he has done an amazingly intricate reading of the Eclogues, found all of these harmonies and rhythms within it that I would never have discovered. So if you're looking for a really interesting edition of the Eclogues or Bucolics, strongly recommend this edition here, published by Johns Hopkins. So anyway, Virgil's Bucolics. And Virgil is, I don't know, when you think of just the influence on the world, and add in artistic quality, maybe the most important writer in the first 1,000 years of Western culture. All right, then you have Horace, Livy, Ovid, Seneca, Pliny the Elder's Natural History, this big anthology or encyclopedia. I'm really interested in getting the full set of that from Loeb Classics Library. Then we get Ban Ku, the history of the former Han Dynasty, so that continues after Sima Qian. Some late classical works, Epictetus, Juvenal, Tacitus. We get the Christian Bible compiled. Probably all the books were written by 100 AD, and then they were canonized, 200 years later. Marcus Aurelius. We have a work from the Tamil that I'm really interested in. Cao Chi, Plotinus, Jerome, the Vulgate, and Dumbarton Oaks has an edition that is a 6th volume of the Vulgate Bible in the Latin, and then the English is the Douay Rheims, and I am very interested in getting that full set. St. Augustine, very important for Western culture, and then Tao Yuan Ming, extremely important for Chinese civilization, and a beautiful poet too. Kalidasa, we get another golden age springing up in the Indian subcontinent from the Imperial Gupta dynasty. The Taine, work of Irish, Proclus, Boethius, really the end of the classical period into the Middle Ages. You get these figures. Bharavi, building off of Kalidasa, these really intricate palindromic court epics, just fascinating stuff. And then, actually, speaking of that, I have two books that I read with my students last year that I thought you guys might be interested in. I can't remember when I showed them last, but I feel strongly that Sanskrit literature is really underread in the general English-speaking literary culture. So I figured I would share some of that after showing some Virgil. So here are two editions of Sanskrit poem anthologies. So this one here, and I'm circling, is published by Harvard, and it is a collection of Vidyakara's treasury. It's about 300 pages from Vidyakara's treasury, which was a treasury done in the 1100s. 11th century Buddhist scholar collected them, but presumably they had been written for 500,000 years and just collected at the end of the period. So this one, and then this one here is much thinner. You can see Penguin Classics you can probably find. Composed in classical Sanskrit, written between the 4th and 10th centuries AD, a purely literary language by the 4th century. So this is also, they're both fairly easy to get a hold of, but we have some Sanskrit anthologies, if you haven't ever read Sanskrit poetry. It's amazing stuff. Many of the poems are really short too. All right, and then Procopius, and that gets me into my next serious interest that I need to develop further, like significantly develop. Basically, things related to Sanskrit and Buddhism, I'm very, very weak on. I've read almost nothing and I know very little. So that's in the next 10 years, that's what I'm really going to focus on. And then the other area that I need to focus on is the Eastern Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, the New Roman Empire. And there was this beautiful edition just published by Oxford University Press, written by Anthony Caldelis, an amazing scholar of Byzantium. And so this kind of symbolizes the fact that I don't know anything about Byzantine literature at all, even the histories. I know the names of some of the poets. I know the names of some of the chroniclers and historians, especially the really famous ones like Michael Psellos and Anna Komnene, a handful of others, Procopius, of course, because I just mentioned. But that is one of my big areas of weakness, and I'm, in the short term, going to be working on that. Dumbarton Oaks has some really good editions of some Byzantine works, so that's probably where I'll start. Anthony Caldelis also has a podcast, so check that out. I need to go much faster if I'm going to get through this with any reasonable amount of time, so I'll just highlight another couple things and then we'll go much faster. All right, Antara ibn Shaddad. So that is another touchstone for something I need to work a lot more on. So probably if you say, okay, like Sanskrit literature, Byzantine literature, and then Islamic, Arabic, classical Arabic literature, which one do I have the most books on and which one have I descriptively learned the most about? I would say Islamic stuff. Antara ibn Shaddad was pre-Islamic, but he was preserved into the history, so he's been very influential for Islamic poetry. So that being said, I might know the most about that cultural region, but compared to other things I've looked into, I know very little. So I do still need to do a lot of work in that. But yeah, so that symbolizes that. Then we get some so-called early Middle Ages stuff. We have some Japanese poetry starting to show up. Hitomaro is the most important poet in the Manyoshu. Then we get to another amazing golden age of world history, and that is the Tang Dynasty. And I have chosen the master himself, Du Fu, to represent that time period. So this is volume 5 of the 6-volume set of the complete poetry of Du Fu, a bilingual edition. Now, you can find this totally free online. Look up Poetry of Du Fu, Stephen Owen. Sorry if it's too dark, but and you'll find the entire 3,000-page set online. I vastly prefer physical books, so I suffered enough to go ahead and get the full set, which was not easy at all. But yeah, so complete poetry of Du Fu symbolizes that. Al-Quoin is alive at the same time. Abu Nuwas was around at the same time as the Tang Dynasty is growing. John Scotus Eriugena. Zen Buddhism is just flowering at this time. We have the Platform Diamond and Heart Sutras. The Arabian Nights probably originates around this time, coming from influences of the Panchatantra. The Poetic Edda. Beowulf is being written at this time. It's just an amazing time in world history. Al-Mutanabi, the greatest poet in Islamic culture. Then we have Ferdowsi, the greatest poet in Persian culture. And then we get our first Byzantine writer, John Geometris. He was affiliated with the Macedonian Renaissance, Tale of Genji, one of the masterworks of world culture. Ibn Sina, Michael Psellos. Then we start to get some other, during the European, Latin, Christendom, Middle Ages, you start to get some influence from the Islamic Golden Age into that. St. Anselm is one of the ones that really kickstarts that as the Archbishop of Canterbury, Su Shi, or Su Thung Po. One of my favorite poets of all time, Al-Hariri, the Makamat, Al-Ghazali, Peter Abelard, Li Qingzhao, one of my favorite poets. Just read her work this past year, and amazing stuff. Then we get Geoffrey of Monmouth. He's an interesting figure because he starts all the Arthurian myths that have been so influential for the last 1,000 years. And as you see, we get him and William of Malmesbury duking it out, born in the same year, roughly. And William of Malmesbury writes about people like Geoffrey of Monmouth who are writing these crazy fictional stories of these historical figures. He just wishes they would stop. Hildegard von Bingen, she's an author I really need to look into more. Don't have a single one of her works. Another Byzantine work, don't know how to say it. Diogenes Acrites. It's an interesting kind of border epic, in a way. Let's see. Then we get the troubadours. Bertrand de Born and Arnaud Daniel are the two that I've liked the most. There are a handful of others I want to get specific volumes of. Marcabru, Rainbow d'Orange, the Georgian Golden Age, this Renaissance of Shosta Rustaveli. What else? Let's see. Sundiata, the Mali Empire, the epic of the Mali Empire. And I'm fascinated with that. I was lucky enough to meet one of the guys who watches some of my videos, and he gifted me a copy of the Sundiata. So it's very kind of him to do that. So I'm going to read that copy pretty soon. All right, then we have an interesting spread here. Snorri Sturluson is alive at the exact same time as St. Francis of Assisi, which is fascinating to think about. Frederick II, Albertus Magnus, Rumi is alive at the same exact time as Albertus Magnus and Roger Bacon. Sadi Shiraz is another one of the great Persian authors. Thomas Aquinas holding it down, 1225 to 1274. Secret History of the Mongols. The Mongol Empire is massive at this time. Marco Polo is just going over to China at this time. And then we have the Tale of the Heike, Dante, which is finishing up Paradiso. I'm reading it by the end of the year, and this is the edition I've been reading. So loving reading through Dante. You get a whole education on the Middle Ages just from reading it closely with some good notes. You get Petrarch. I just read his biography. It was amazing to learn about. Ibn Khaldun, one of the most intelligent people in world history. We have Chaucer. Then we start to get the 4 great Chinese classics. At least one of the sets of the 4 great Chinese classics. Romance of the Three Kingdoms, Outlaws in the Marsh. We get the Catalan Renaissance going. We already had Ramon Lull, but then we have Ausias Marc in 1400 to 1459. Nezahualcóyotl, who is the greatest Aztec poet we have record of. And you can find his works in translation. Fascinating stuff. Read that with my students too. Then you get Erasmus. Erasmus is a figure I've been looking at a lot more recently. Erasmus was born in the same year as Moctezuma II. So, the emperor of the Aztec Empire that Cortez messed with. So it's just fascinating to make those connections, I think. Nicholas Copernicus, 1473. Ludovico Ariosto, 1 year after. Rabelais, it's 1490. Just as the Middle Ages is ending, give or take in this time, if it ever ended. Let's see, Teresa of Avila, Du Bellay, Ronsard, Camus, Jan Kochanowski, and then Montaigne. Montaigne really feels like, to me, almost an insane bridge point between the Middle Ages and our time. Now, I think you could make a pretty good argument that the Middle Ages never ended, but if you think that they did, Montaigne somehow feels like perfectly medieval, but he also doesn't. And I think maybe you could make the same argument for Shakespeare. Shakespeare is another one of these figures that somehow feels medieval, but then doesn't. And I think these figures add to my argument that the Middle Ages either never existed or it never ended. I think those are the two options. Tasso, Cervantes, we have Journey to the West, which is the third out of the four great Chinese novels. Tang Jiansu, who is the Chinese Shakespeare, alive at exactly the same time pretty much, and wrote some of the most important plays. Let's see, who else? Plum and the Golden Vase. This is number 5 out of the 4 great Chinese classics. I did try to limit the number of scientists and people who weren't artists on here, really. Either artists or historians or general intellectuals. But there are people like Galileo or Kepler that I just felt like they were so important. So I did add them. Mullah Sadra. Let's see. Skip to. There were people like René Descartes, where I'm not sure if I'm ever going to read his stuff, honestly. But he's so influential that maybe, I'll just end up with one of his works and just read them quickly. Then we have the major French playwrights, Corneille, Molière, Pascal, Spinoza, 1632, born the same year as John Locke. Samuel Pepys was born 1 year after, and Racine. Let's see, we have the Thai epic, or the epic of Siam, written around the year 1700. Isaac Newton, Leibniz, Sorwana. Let's see, and then this is where we really start to get the numbers pick up per century. Up to this point, I think maybe the most I've had is the 16th century or the 12th century. The 12th century has 24 authors or works. The 16th century has 30. Then the 17th century only has 23. 18th century only has 22. And then when we get to the 19th century, it's 81 authors. So that is clearly my bias. That's probably a little bit before most people's bias. I think if you just took the average reader, their bias would be their median year would be maybe like the year 2005, and that's maybe being generous even. If you take the average educated or curious reader, maybe their average would be 1950 of, when their authors lived. For mine, I don't know what it would be, but it would be sometime in the 19th century for the median. The mean would be way far back. But 19th century is clearly my expertise, my specialty, at least people born in the 19th century. A lot of the works that I know a lot, modernism and so on, where people were born in the 19th century and then they were written in the 20th century. You get some interesting facts like Thomas Carlyle and John Keats were born in the same year. Hölderlin, Hegel, Wordsworth were all born in the same year. Just so interesting to look at some of these details. The great Vietnamese epic poem, The Tale of Q. Let's see. And then probably end this. I did include some major works that I do want to own, like James Murray, editor of the New English Dictionary, the Oxford English Dictionary, the 11th edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica. I would like to get a full set of that at some point. So I've included those on there. Yeah, and then really solid modernist section, I would say. And then when we get to people born in the 20th century, my level of confidence drops off significantly as far as my selections of authors from the 19th century, born in the 19th century. I'm pretty confident that, you know, assuming this is even possible for a variety of reasons, I think if we imagine in 500 years, what are people in the future going to be interested in reading if they care about the past at all? I think they'll be reading stuff from this list. Yeah, I'm missing some, definitely. But I do think a decent chunk of things is there. My confidence in that way drops off completely when we get to the 20th century. Now, you might have some authors from the early 20th century, you know, have like a Senkuthi, you have a Beckett, Guimarães Rosa, Simone Weil. Those people, I'm pretty sure they're still going to be reading in 500 years. But I am not at all confident that anyone will be reading Thomas Bernhard, watching Andrei Tarkovsky, Leon Forrest, W.G. Sebald, especially when you get to people born during or after World War II. I have zero confidence. That gets to the point where I'm trying to imagine what will stand the test of time, and yeah, I'm just unsure if it will. Some of the books, obviously, I haven't read. El Troya Accord, Levantul, Giochi dell'Eternità. I'm saying that even closely correct. But they have the ambition to hold interest for 500 to 1,000 years. So we'll throw those on there. But I'm almost certainly missing a bunch. But one thing I am pretty proud of is that the most recent century, the 20th century, is not the most populated. It only has 40 authors. So, with that being said, I'm working on pushing my average back, because the odds that the greatest author of all time, or even the top 10, like the odds that even one are from the last 100 years is exceptionally low. And that was the real thing for me I wanted to focus on, because, you know, most people just spend all their time, you know, kind of, I'm going to say it how I think to myself, navel gazing at themselves, obsessed with themselves, just unbearably obsessed with their own time and their own way of thinking. And I just get so bored with that. I get so bored with our current day, the way life is today. I've already thought about it enough. You know, of course you have to think about it every day, but I've thought about our time enough. I'm just sick of it, basically, at this point. Now, that could pass, whatever. And of course, like I said, I still think about our time every day and am involved with it. But the fact is that the vast majority of the best stuff ever written was written before the year 1900, before the year 1800. And I just think it would be a life thrown away if I never looked into that. So that explains a decent chunk of my list. Now, the list ends at roughly 1970 with Evan Dara. Now, what will this list look like in the future? I decided that would be kind of an interesting way of ending this video, because I've been thinking about ecology and civilizational scale stuff so much recently. And you know, you can have no idea exactly what the future will look like. I'm not sure necessarily what will happen tomorrow, but it is obvious that our current way of living is totally unsustainable over even a 100-year time span. So that means that if there was a change from, if you can argue there was a change in material culture from the Middle Ages to now, the change from now to 100 years will have to be an even larger change. Probably a simplification of a sort. So one of the reasons why I think about this list is because I do like to think about, okay, well, we obviously have an exact scope on what we are reading now that was written 1,000 years ago. And I'm meaning, educated people who actually care about knowing anything. So I want to think to myself, in 500 years, what will be saved? What will be saved? People like Virgil will be saved. People like Du Fu will be saved. People like Dante and Shakespeare will be saved. T.S. Eliot, I'll throw him in there. He will definitely be saved. It is likely that a decent chunk of the people on my list will not be. But I do want to kind of think a little bit about what kind of literature, what kind of value system, what kind of author will be highly valued in the future. And I have a couple books to show that I think might elucidate that a little bit. So this is a book that I've been interested in for a while, Always Coming Home. Ursula K. Le Guin imagines a future society. An anthropologist report survivors of an ecological catastrophe living in a future Napa Valley. I'm just reading off the back here, because this is one I want to read over the next year. And presumably it's a few hundred years in the future. I can't remember exactly if it says specifically, but Ursula K. Le Guin imagines what poetry and song will look like in hundreds of years. And I think that's an extremely valuable way of thinking, because inevitably there are works that were written 1,000 years ago that were hugely popular in their time that only the most specialized specialist would be able to tell you about or even have read. Even if they know about it, maybe they haven't read it, and it's their specialty. And it's interesting that sometimes the things that were underappreciated in their time are now amazingly popular. To a minor degree, you have people like Herman Melville. Also, some Chinese poets were underappreciated in their time and became hugely famous. Some individual poems too. And so when I think in like this direction, always coming home, what will we be coming home to? What will be our home, our cultural literary home in the next few hundred years? Arne Naess kind of helps me think through that, because people would say, in this deep ecology way, oh, he's a pessimist, he thinks things are just horrible. And his kind of quip related to that is, I'm a pessimist for the 21st century, but I'm an optimist for the 22nd century. And I think that right now, some people need to be thinking about writing the book for the 22nd century. And in the same vein, to give myself 30 more seconds, I have another book I'm working on, a little bit more than halfway through this one, Toward an Ecological Civilization, Abundant Earth. And this gives an idea of what an ecological, sustainable, what a civilization that actually values nature and doesn't exploit and destroy it. What would that look like? It starts to imagine at the very end, the part that I haven't gotten to fully yet. But I think that's an extremely valuable way of thinking. And if you write for too far in the future, your work will never get read in the present. But I think that's okay sometimes. So that's my final thought. Let me know if I missed anything. Give a strong argument for it, please, if I did. And make your own list. I would love it to see other people make their list, share it. That'd be really cool. So anyway, death is a gang boss.